So first of all, this is so beautiful. Thank you. And when Agarthe were talking yesterday, I thought there's a Jewish prayer for a special occasion. And this is clearly a special occasion. So I'm going to recite it. And it just says, thanks to gods who have brought us together for this special occasion. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shehechianu v'higianu lazman hazeh. So when I grew up, my family had been in Minnesota for 100 years, or almost 75 years. We were liberal, we were Jewish, we were not Orthodox, but we were observant. And it's felt like we had always been in Minnesota. I mean, I especially for Midwestern Jews, I had great-grandparents born in Minnesota. My mother's family is from Kaunas. My mother's father's family is from Tukums. My father's family is mostly from Tulsi, Mitau, and mostly Kuldaga. The name is Neimer and Hirsch. So we knew that they came from Latvia, and we had this sort of general story. Oh, they were fleeing the pogroms. Oh, they were fleeing the draft. We never knew how they got to America or anything. And even though David was in our life, he was not respected as much as he should have been for his writing. He wrote a 500-page poetry from the Bible in English, and then he wrote a smaller one, which we have given to the museum here, of Bible verses. They were not great literature, but they were serious poems. And we have all the letters of rejection from publishers' houses. They got rejected by all the publishers, but he was rich enough to self-publish. We had boxes of them in our basement. And he also wrote a novel. And he was also a serious intellectual, totally self-taught. We don't know if he ever went to school much at all. We don't know how he learned English. But he sat in the back of his store. And as an example of our family, he was known as the pencil pusher. If you can understand, pushing the pencil. And it was kind of a derogatory term, meaning that he was supposed to be making money. But instead, he's sitting in the back with his books and his papers. So that was the image we had. And I had a childhood memory that there was a box of unpublished manuscripts that had gone missing, that had disappeared. And I have these childhood memories. We would look through my grandmother's attic and try to find this mysterious box. And then in 2008, which is now 17 years ago, I got an email from my cousin Sean Bentley, and I'll just read the first couple sentences. I want to tell you some family-related news you'll find very exciting. We finally moved into our new house, and while relocating my stuff, I found a box of unpublished typed novels that David Blumenfeld wrote. I have had these from some time, given to my mother by our Aunt Belle, but I had not looked at them for years. I now saw there's a 2-volume set called Diary. I opened it and I started reading. And it begins as a fictional account, using pseudonyms, of the history of the Blumenfelds going back to almost 1825. It tells the story of Benze and his wife Lynetta, interspersing it with background about Tsar Nicholas, the Russian Empire, the Jewish tradition, and how they arrived in America. So it turns out that when David died, his favorite daughter, Belle, gave the manuscripts to a niece who was a writer, an accomplished poet and writer. Apparently she looked at them, thought they were just totally stupid, put them in the box, but did not throw them away. And they sat in that box for 55 years. I should also tell you, because this is part of the story, the latter half of the book talks a lot about how no good my grandfather was for various reasons, and how no good Sean's grandmother was. She married an atheist communist, ran away from the family, and her children converted to Christianity. In fact, I just have to tell you, in one of these precious moments, we were in the synagogue in Riga in 2012, and my sister said to Sean, "When was the last time you were in a synagogue?" And he said, "This is the first time." So it's so ironic that it was the Episcopalian family that ended up with the manuscripts. So just to explain what I did for this publication, there were several problems with the diary. One is the last third he never finished. It has notes about it. We met with this person, but he never finished it. The second is when it was typed. My mother remembers that in 1944, when David was 80, almost 90 years old, he decided he was going to learn to type. But he couldn't figure it out, so he hired a typist. But it's clear there were mistakes made. There's some pages that show up twice. There's some sections that there's different versions of. So, and also, the diary has dozens of pages of historical narrative, which will be very interesting to all of you. And the website that we've launched, and Irita refers to it, links to the website in the description of the exhibit. It has the full 300 pages. He has these explanations about the Constantists? Is that their other? Cantonists. The Cantonists. He has a whole explanation of the Seder, which is very relevant to this. He has explanations of Zionism, and I decided that for my family, this was for, that was just too much information. As historians, you will love this, but the family members, it was too much. And I also needed to change the names back to the original, the real names, so that my family could follow it. The other thing, I just have to tell you, because it was so much fun to do this, when we went to create this book, this is interesting experience, we hired a designer who found the same font that the typewriter was in 1944 to make it look like this was actually how it was typed. The other thing we did is my sister, who is a very prominent Jewish historian of the 19th century, who has gone through all of this to try to see how much of this was accurate and how much was not accurate. And my cousins, my non-Jewish cousins, we started having this dialogue about the book. And we were going to have alternating chapters. David, my sister, me. And one day I was sitting in my parents' synagogue, clearly kind of bored. And in the Talmud, as they're published today in English and Hebrew, the tradition is to have the main text in the middle of each page and commentaries on the side. It's sort of a tradition. I don't know where this tradition comes from, but there'll be the main text, and then Rabbi Eliezer said this, and Rabbi Gabriel said that. And I looked at it, I thought, oh, that's how we will design the book. So that's the origin of this book design, where you have, if you want, you can just ignore the commentaries and read what David wrote. And then, but if you want, you can read what the four of us had to say about it. So, what was amazing about this experience for us, first of all, when we read it, to us, it was fiction. We had no idea that any of it was true. And when I read the first page, and I'll just read you these first two sentences. 1863. One bright spring morning when the sun was benevolently smiling on all nature, Leah, that's David's mother, was sitting on the veranda of her 2-story dwelling overlooking the great Parade Platz marketplace in her native town of Tukums, Courland. Leah, with her shawl tightly drawn over her shoulders, was sat holding her infant child. And this is what was so profound when I arrived here. The marketplace was smoothly paved with gray cobblestones, was kept scrupulously clean. What stories the worn stones could tell. How many differently shod feet had passed over them, from the coarse hard sole of a bare foot to the silken elegance of a lady's slipper. One day it was used each week as the city market, where peasants brought their garden truck with their fruits, and one day was preserved for the volunteer fire brigade, and 4 days a week were used for military drill. And when we arrived, my sister said this brilliantly. She said, until we got here, this was just a story. And then when we got here, we saw that it was a place. And I remember reading this to you, and the idea that I would be coming from the United States to bring this story of Tukums in 1863 back here, 150 years after David was born, was not something that could have been imagined. So let me just talk just really briefly about some of the most important things we learned as a family from this book and from this work that you have all done here. One is, we really did not understand that Courland, how prosperous it was, how developed it was, how architecturally sophisticated it was. Most American Jews think of themselves coming from a shtetl in rural Poland where there were a few ramshackle wooden buildings. And we really never understood, and this is why we put this picture on the cover, where David ended up in South St. Paul was not as elegant as Tukums. It was not an architectural upgrade to come to America. He was coming from a very well-developed, prosperous place. We did not know that. We also really never understood how the interfamily dynamics and economies, we believe, had much more to do with his emigration, Ben Zion's, than the conditions for Jews. There were not pogroms here. Jews were not mistreated here in the 1880s. There were problems in the larger Russian Empire, but not here. And Ben Zion, who made the decision to come, David just came along with his family. Ben Zion's decision, and this is why this map is so wonderful, is the result of this lifelong wandering. Truly the wandering Jew. He goes from Königsberg, where his father was from, at some point maybe, then to here, then to the Crimea. His flour mill gets flooded. He comes back to Tukums. There's this long explanation about his failed businesses and how his wealthy in-laws, the Klatsovs, were constantly rescuing him. They create a bakery business for the daughters. We think they probably provided maybe a house for them. My sister speculates that they may have paid for Ben Zion to go to America. You always wondered, where did he raise enough money? And it talks in the book about how they worked in the bakery to make enough money for Ben Zion to go. But it's much more about his failures as a business person and the notion that America was this place where he could finally get rich. And just to tell you, just to finish this little piece about this, Ben Zion is buried in the synagogue in the cemetery Jewish cemetery. In fact, the new Jewish cemetery opened in 1920, and Ben Zion Blumenfeld is the first to be buried in that cemetery. But he actually doesn't stay in Minnesota. He goes to Oregon, tries to have a farm. It fails. I realize you have to add that to the list. He goes to Oregon. He then comes to San Francisco, little did I know, where he also fails. And the funniest thing you learn from these books, we always knew where Ben Zion was born, but we never knew where Leah was born, his wife. We never knew where she was buried. And at the end of the book, it says that they went to San Francisco and they both came back to Minnesota. But when she died, her one instructions, she said, the last thing I want to do is spend all eternity next to Ben Zion. So she insisted on being buried at a cemetery in Minneapolis, 15 miles away. We've now found her grave, but we never knew why she was not buried, and then we got the explanation. So what I think that what's been the most important for us, actually, is first of all to see that these themes that David writes about, his obsession with how to be successful, and you fail at this and you fail at that. One of the things he says about his father in the introduction is that one of the reasons his father failed is that he was too religious. Because if you're going to make it in America, you have to work on Saturday. Especially if you're in the retail business. Because all stores, it's a Christian nation, the stores were all closed on Sunday, and the people have to work Monday through Friday. And so the idea was that Ben Zion was too observant to get rich in America. Interesting detail. But these conflicts about how do you make it, and who is successful, and who is a failure, just is so dominant in his book. A little bit about how Jewish to be. But what we realize is these debates that we had in our own family about who was successful, who was not successful, how do you make it as a Jew in a minority society? Because I did not grow up in New York. We were a definite minority in our town. And how do you maintain your religious tradition while also assimilating into the society? So I just want to leave by telling you one story that's not in the book and not in this book, and I'll tell you why. When we were researching for the book in your archivist, so you'll understand this, we came across, we wanted to get these advertisements from his dress manufacturing stores, and how he was, where he says, I make $45 suits, and I was trying to get better images of these ads. So I researched the Minnesota newspapers, and out of the blue comes a notice of filing for bankruptcy by David Blumenfeld, 1898. And in his diary, he says, oh, well, it was a rough couple of years, hard to make money. But as he's bad-mouthing everyone else in the family for not being successful, lo and behold, he files for bankruptcy. Since you're archivist, I made the bankruptcy archivist so happy in St. Louis because she sent me the 68 pages listing every object. This is, hopefully when we have a Minnesota exhibit, this will be there. It lists every object that was in his clothing factory or workshop. And but 4 years later, he opens his store. But the sweetest part of this is that when we were producing this, and I said to my mother, we need to include this about the bankruptcy. This is the difference between a historian and a mother or a granddaughter. She said, he wanted to keep it secret, we're going to keep it secret. And she wouldn't allow us to put it into the book because she thought, if he didn't want to tell it, we shouldn't tell it. And then I'll just close by saying one of the many questions we have is, who was he writing this for? Because he says all these terrible things about my grandfather and other people, yet he also says so much about the history. And I guess I now can say he wrote it so we could bring it here.
Vienkārši tāds elementāras lietas uzrunā. Lūk, šeit arī to grāmatu var redzēt, un tā ir Rabīna Lichtensteina tātad sarakstīta un izdota grāmata. Tas ir